There's always something special about visiting an island. You usually get away from it all, or see something completely different from the rest of the world you know. Or maybe it's a more exaggerated version of the world you know. People are always looking for awesome island vacations in the summer. So let's look at the 10 best islands to visit within reasonable driving distance from the northeastern United States. Up first, we head to Block Island, which encompasses the Rhode Island town of New Shoreham. It's 10 miles off the coast, so almost everyone takes the ferry in from Narragansett. Now, most people venture to this island to stay long-term, with rentals or second homes here. And a lot of the island looks kind of quiet. And looking at the map, it doesn't look like much ado about anything. But go there in person, and there are actually a number of delightful things, I must say. The Old Harbor neighborhood is where all the commerce is, and most of the people are at any given time, given its proximity to the ferry. And you do have some nice-looking buildings and a walkable area for about 3 blocks. But then, there are actually some nice Easter eggs sprinkled throughout the island, which makes it worth venturing around. My favorite small things around the island are the overlook at the Ocean View Pavilion near the Old Port, the Southeast Lighthouse, the beach walk to the North Lighthouse at the northern end of the island, the nature preserves at the northern end and all around, like with Rodman's Hollow to the south, and the farmers market at Legion Park, the scenery around the Great Salt Pond, the Native American Cemetery, but mostly the cliffs and stairway at Mohegan Bluffs at the southern end. There aren't a ton of conventional beaches, but everything else is just interesting enough to make this a worthwhile vacation destination, so it belongs on this list. We head far away from the Atlantic Ocean now, and instead head to Ohio, into Lake Erie at South Bass Island, which is known for containing the village of Put-in Bay. This will actually be the smallest island on this list, at under 2.5 square miles. This one's just 3 miles north off the coast of northwestern Ohio, so most people take the ferry from Catawba Island, which is no longer an island, between the cities of Sandusky and Port Clinton. Now, this island is really just catering to tourists, and there really aren't many, if any, historic buildings, and the center of town is mostly entertainment establishments, like bars, restaurants, hotels, or tourist attractions, like a carousel smack in the middle of town. There aren't any beaches really, and they're going for the relaxing vacation atmosphere during the day and a nightlife scene at night. Since the island is small, many people are just walking to wherever they're going, or renting golf carts to get around. Now, let's discuss the main attraction, as you've probably seen in these clips so far. The Perry's Victory and International Peace Memorial towers 352 feet in the air at the island's narrowest point, and it commemorates the Battle of Lake Erie from the War of 1812, and the leader of the battle, Oliver Hazard Perry, as well as James Lawrence, who coined the phrase, "Don't give up the ship," which is posted on flags and walls all around the island. And then, like most islands, there are some small nature preserves and things like that, but not as big or expansive as the other islands. But it's still, overall, a charming small island. Oh, I was also there for one of their events, that being their soccer tournament, and it was nice seeing the island filled with life. Wikipedia says that people sometimes call this island the Key West of Lake Erie, and I can see why. But you can be the judge of that when you go. Nantucket is about 11 miles south off the coast of Massachusetts, but it requires a 20-mile ferry ride from Hyannis. It's a well-known destination for summer travelers, long-term vacationers, and people with second homes. The more touristy part is the very center of town, where the ferry comes in, and that's where you have the cobblestone Main Street, historic buildings, restaurants, and interesting walkable neighborhoods. Then, you can venture out to the rest of the island, where you have beaches and lighthouses and bodies of water all around. And there are 2 other substantial neighborhoods outside the center, one being Madaket at the western end, and then at the eastern end, the Siasconset or Sconset neighborhood, which has a nice close-knit and walkable vibe. And overall, you could really have a nice adventure on this island, for as long as you plan to stay, so I hope you get the chance to visit. Now for this list, I'm breaking the rules and going slightly outside of the northeastern US, because this island needs to be on your list if you haven't been yet. Prince Edward Island, which is the smallest province of Canada, is an absolute gem, and it's the largest island on this list. It's a nearly 4-hour drive from Maine, but it's entirely worth it if you get the chance. It sits in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, 8 miles off the coast of New Brunswick, and 13 miles off mainland Nova Scotia. You can either take the long Confederation Bridge if you're going directly from the States, or if you're already in Nova Scotia, you can take the very entertaining ferry ride from just outside Pictou, where it feels like you're in the middle of nowhere. Now, there are cities on the island, but most of the scenery will look like this. Just incredible vast expanses of farms of many colors and rolling hills and bodies of water. It truly is how they describe it in Anne of Green Gables. And you can go all over the island and see how things are different in different areas and check out all the lighthouses and small towns as well. The main city and capital is Charlottetown, and it's really beautiful, but not overly grand. There are tons of interesting buildings and churches and parks and a tourist zone right at the water, but I will warn you, even in the peak of the summer, everything seemed to close up around 8 p.m. local time. Now, the other place everyone likes going to is the north central part of the island at Cavendish. That's where you have the Prince Edward Island National Park and the well-known beaches, and the amazing red cliffs, which feel like they're unreal right out of a storybook. And speaking of storybooks, don't be daunted by the tourists. You'll be right at Green Gables, the location and setting for the famous Canadian literary series of Anne of Green Gables. Yes, it's a tourist trap, but just do it. It costs so little, and you're already there. Just go inside and check it out. Maybe you'll get a sense of why these stories in this setting sold so well amongst Canadians and others alike. And overall, there's something about this island that appeals to so many, so I hope you go and see what it's like for yourself. We now stay in Canada, but come way closer to the US border, to a place I know you've all heard of, Île de Montréal, or in English, the island of Montreal, or Montreal Island. This is way closer to the US than you think, as it's just 30 miles north of New York State, just 50 miles north of Plattsburgh. Now, you've definitely all heard of Montreal, and probably know what's interesting about it, but let me quickly give you the highlights. It's the second largest city in Canada, the largest in Quebec, and it's almost entirely French-speaking, although most people can also speak and understand English on the island. There are countless tourist attractions and interesting cultural things downtown, too many to list. There are some gigantic shopping centers, both above and below ground, with underground tunnels all over. And in the summer, there always appears to be some big outdoor performances at the Place des Festivals and along the pedestrian road at St. Catherine Street. But most tourists prefer the Old City section and Vieux Port, where again, there are just interesting sub-neighborhoods, buildings, churches, parklets, plazas, and tourist piers into the St. Lawrence River, with all kinds of events. Then, this city and island has one of the most interesting central parks I've ever been to. Right in the center of the island, but right near downtown, is Mount Royal, which has a lake, park-like sections, wooded sections, and pavilions, but you don't really care about that. It's all about going to the top of the mountain, right? There are some awesome winding roads and hiking and biking trails and stairways up to the top of the mountain, where you can get to the big cross, or more excitingly, the chalet, where you can see the entire main part of the city. It's just an incredible experience every time I do it. Then, there are other interesting neighborhoods sprinkled around, and even some interesting suburban towns that are also on the island, especially at the western end, with charming waterfront towns like Dorval and Sainte-Anne-de-Bellevue. It's a long hike or bike ride out there, but it's fun if you have a lot of extra time. People also enjoy the islands in the St. Lawrence River with their tourist attractions, but that's not on Montreal Island, so I'm not allowed to talk about it. So in total, if you are considering visiting Montreal but haven't yet, hopefully this sparks your interest. I know I will irk some people with this next one, but we all have to admit, Manhattan Island is an incredible place to visit, especially if you've never been before. It's the epicenter of the nation's largest city, and the continent's second largest city, and it has all the cultural attractions you could ever think of. If you like outdoor activities, you can walk around all day anywhere, but you'll probably be sticking to the perimeter of the island and Central Park, all of which are incredible places to visit. You can find exciting things in any neighborhood of the island, or at least the southern half of the island, and don't forget the super touristy areas of Times Square and the general Midtown area. I know locals hate it, but tourists do love it, and for quite obvious reasons. I know it's super duper urban, and it's not everyone's cup of tea, but you'd be delusional to think it's never worth checking out. So do so if you haven't yet. I'll move on to the next one though. We head back to Rhode Island for a historically and culturally significant island, Aquidneck Island, which is also historically known as Rhode Island, the namesake of the state. It sits in the Narragansett Bay, and it's most notable for containing the historic city of Newport. There are 3 bridges onto and off the island, one to Bristol, one to Tiverton towards Fall River, Massachusetts, and one towards the mainland of southwestern Rhode Island. Now, there are 2 suburban towns to the north of Newport, those being Portsmouth and Middletown, but they're not interesting at all to me, other than the wildlife sanctuary at the southeast point of the island. So now, let's just talk about Newport. Downtown is filled with interesting old things, as Newport was the largest city in the colony at the time, and it has a huge sports history with tennis, golf, and sailing, including with the International Tennis Hall of Fame. And it also has a big maritime history and Jewish history, with the oldest American synagogue. There are tons of piers and wharfs with tourist attractions and restaurants, and then, throughout the entire southeast portion of town, there are tons of historic mansions, some of which you can go in. There are also 2 state parks, Brenton Point and Fort Adams, both right on the open water. But the absolute best part is the 3-mile cliff walk running from Memorial Boulevard, south by the Salve Regina University campus on top of the cliffs, past the Breakers Mansion, and then on the rocks through tunnels the rest of the way to Bailey Beach. It's definitely my favorite coastal walking trail in New England. There's more I can say, but you get the point. Make time for a trip to Newport and Aquidneck Island. We head back to Massachusetts to the other famous resort island, Martha's Vineyard. This is often compared to the nearby island of Nantucket, but I definitely recommend this one more. It's less than 4 miles south off of Cape Cod, and it's a relatively short ferry ride over, but there are certainly more points of interest here. First of all, there are 3 bustling towns of Oak Bluffs, Edgartown, and Tisbury, with its downtown known as Vineyard Haven. There are plenty of cultural places and activities in all these towns, and there are generally more interesting things to see, more inland bodies of water, accessible beaches, and it's also a pretty interesting trip over to the far end of the island, to the town of Aquina. And it's fun to see the lighthouse and cliffs at the very end. Otherwise, my favorite spot is in Oak Bluffs, where the ferries usually go, where the downtown is set up for tourists. And the best part is the colorful cottages known as the gingerbread houses at the Martha's Vineyard Camp Meeting Association, also known as Wesleyan Grove. It's an absolutely fantastic place to explore around in the summer, and you'll have a good time, regardless of what you're specifically interested in. Let's head to Maine, to the most famous island there, Mount Desert Island. This island is known for being the home to Acadia National Park, and for the extremely touristy town of Bar Harbor. Yeah, everywhere I go in the Northeast, I see people with Bar Harbor sweatshirts at any time of year. There's one road onto the island from the mainland, so there can be traffic in the summer, and parking in Bar Harbor can be difficult, but worthwhile. So let's talk about Bar Harbor first. Downtown is really packed, with mostly tourist-oriented shops and small hotels and rentals and bed and breakfasts. It seems like this was once a historic town before it was completely hijacked by the tourism industry. But that being said, it's still very walkable, filled with interesting things and parks and a nice shore walk, and views of the other islands and open harbors and bays. The highlight for many people is the land bridge to Bar Island, as long as you make it back to the mainland before the tide comes in. In total, it's a nice place filled with tourists over the summer, but you'll be one of them, so that's okay. There are other towns on the island that aren't nearly as bustling, like Southwest Harbor, but people do venture there too. But now for the main attraction, Acadia National Park. This is an incredible collection of mountains right on the coast, as well as granite domes, glacial lakes, odd rocks, and trails going through it all. Just please do your research before you go. I got misled by Google into taking my bike on a rock trail all the way up to the top of Cadillac Mountain, and everyone was laughing at me. And don't be in too much of a rush either. The views from the tops of these mountains are stunning in every direction, including looking back at downtown Bar Harbor. I can't really do this island much justice now, but go for yourself and experience what it's like. Now, if I haven't named your favorite island yet, hopefully I name it here, in the 10 honorable mentions list. But now, it's time to reveal the final island on this list. This might be controversial, since it requires a 5-hour drive from outside the states I cover in this channel. But if you're willing to go directly north from western Ohio, you will arrive at a ferry to the greatest vacation island imaginable, and that is Mackinac Island. For those who don't know the Great Lakes well, this island sits right by the Straits of Mackinac, where Lake Huron meets Lake Michigan, right by the bridge that connects the lower and upper peninsulas of Michigan. and this is on the Lake Huron side. You can catch a ferry from either side of the bridge, but Mackinac City to the south seems to be the bigger tourist town, and St. Ignace is a larger ferry terminal. Now let's look at the island. On the map, it looks just okay, but the map does not do it justice. So let's start with perhaps the most interesting fact about this island. There are no cars on the island at all, so everyone is moving about by walking, biking, or with horse-drawn carriages. There's about a quarter mile of super packed downtown to the south, with all kinds of shops and eateries and tons of people and bikes passing through, right by the ferry terminals, again. And there are nice waterside parks on each end, and there are more things a block inland. So now, let's mention the two largest sites in town. The Grand Hotel, which you can't miss just up the hill, and then, just up the cliff from Marquette Park is Fort Mackinac, which you can pay to go in, or just look at, and there are tons of other interesting things to explore around and walk to or into. Then there are other nicely designed hotels, like the Mission Point Resort, and other waterfront parks all around the island. There's also somewhat of a gridded neighborhood up the hill that's not as nice, but has some other tourist attractions. And there are also several locations with historical posts referencing a movie that was filmed there, called Somewhere in Time, and that just adds to the whole aura of this place. So now, let's talk about the trail around the island, which is technically called Michigan Route 185. It's an absolutely amazing 8-mile loop around the island, and the whole thing feels like a gigantic park. It runs through the trees right on the shore, and right at the bottom of the cliffs all around, especially at the east side of the island. There are trailheads to the island's interior and historical posts all around, and there's also a gathering area at the British landing near the northern end. And then, the trails that run through the center of the island are filled with interesting Easter eggs and tons of points of interest, like large boulders, rock formations, or forts, like Fort Holmes. And some of the trails have separate sections for bikes or horse carriages, as many tourist groups take rides to places like the top of Arch Rock. It's just nearly impossible to get bored on this island, and it's not so dauntingly big. I'll admit, I was only there for 4 hours, but it felt like I was in a completely different world, or in a dream or something. It was that sublime. Most people spend more time than I did, so I really recommend you make the trip at some point in your life and see for yourself just why everyone's talking about this place. You will not regret it. Well, I hope you enjoyed this list, and please let me know if there are any islands you enjoyed better that didn't make this list. In the meantime, I hope you have some new places on your itinerary to visit this summer, or summers to come. Or let me know what it's like on these islands in the winter. I'd love to know. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.